How powerful was the emperor? I ask myself this question every night as I try to sleep. I was there at Ullanor, you see. A simple remembrancer sent to record his triumph. The official records tell of a glorious battle, of the emperor striking down the orc warlord with his flaming sword, a heroic tale for children across 1,000,000 worlds. But what I witnessed that day was something else entirely. When the orc charged, the emperor merely raised his hand, no effort, no strain, just a simple gesture, and reality broke. The massive greenskin did not die, it simply ceased to exist. Around him, even the primarchs trembled and averted their eyes. And when his gaze passed over me, every memory, every hidden sin I ever had was laid bare before something vast and merciless. What kind of being could unmake reality with a thought? What kind of father could rewrite the minds of his own sons? I am Jalen Ma. I was once a remembrancer of the Great Crusade. Now I am simply the keeper of a truth too terrible to forget and too dangerous to share. The triumph at Ullanor. Even saying those words feels like invoking an incantation, a summons to powers I have spent decades trying to forget. You have heard the stories, no doubt. The great victory over the Greenskin Empire, the elevation of Horus Lupercal to War Master, the Emperor returning to Terra to work on his secret project deep beneath the palace. A pivotal moment in Imperial history, recorded and recounted countless times across 10,000 years. But what you have heard is a shadow, a comforting falsehood. I know, for I helped craft it. The official remembrancer accounts speak of the Emperor's martial prowess that day. How he met the orc warlord Urlak Urg in single combat and struck him down with the swing of his flaming sword. A heroic battle between humanity's master and the beast that sought to devour us all. It makes for a fine legend. Children across 1,000,000 worlds sleep better for it. The truth is far simpler and infinitely more terrifying. I was there, standing among the mortal contingent, a nobody with a data slate and vox recorder, tasked with documenting the spectacle for posterity. One face in a sea of humanity, watching as gods walked among us. The preparations alone were staggering in scale. An entire valley transformed into a parade ground large enough to host the assembled might of multiple legion detachments. Hundreds of thousands of Imperial army troops standing in formation so precise that from my vantage point, they resembled nothing so much as fields of wheat, golden in the Ullanor sun, their uniforms immaculate despite the dust that seemed to coat everything on that accursed world. And then there were the Astartes, the Space Marines, the Angels of Death. No image, no picked capture, no written description can truly convey what it means to stand in their presence. Each one a monument to genetic mastery, towering over mortal men, their armor gleaming with the heraldry of their legions, their stillness more intimidating than any display of aggression could ever be. Even they were dwarfed by their gene fathers, the Primarchs, demigods made flesh. I remember Magnus the Red, his single eye burning like a newborn star. Sanguinius, his wings casting a shadow that seemed to extend far beyond what physics should allow. Mortarion, a specter of death whose very presence made the air feel thin in my lungs. Angron, barely contained violence personified. Dawn, Korax, the Khan, all of them beings of such overwhelming presence that to look directly at them was to feel something fundamental break inside your mind. The understanding that you were infinitely small, infinitely insignificant, and yet they too were merely satellites orbiting the true sun of that gathering, the Emperor. How does one describe him? I have spent 60 years trying to find the words. Even now my hands shake as I attempt to commit this to record. It is not fear that causes this tremor. Not entirely. It is the fundamental insufficiency of language itself. He appeared as a man. That is what all accounts agree upon. But that statement is as meaningless as saying a sun appears as a light in the sky. The scale of understatement borders on blasphemy. The first thing you must understand is that he did not need to speak to command attention. He did not need to move to dominate every space he occupied. His physical form, magnificent though it was merely the smallest part of his presence. When the Emperor walked onto the plains of Ulanor that day, I felt him before I saw him. We all did. A pressure behind the eyes, a sudden awareness of a vast attention focusing on this single point in space and time. The air became charged, not with electricity, but with meaning, as though reality itself suddenly remembered it was being observed and stood more rigidly to attention. I remember thinking, in that moment of his arrival, that I finally understood why some men fall to their knees before manifestations of the divine. It was not worship, it was structural integrity. Standing in his presence required active effort, as though gravity itself had multiplied tenfold around him. His armor was gold, yes. His countenance was noble and stern and beautiful beyond the capacity of mortal genetics. These are the features recorded in 1,000,000 frescoes and statues across the Imperium, but they are lies, not because they are inaccurate, but because they are incomplete. To look at the Emperor was to see not just what was before you, but every possibility of what could be. His face was both youthful and ancient, both kind and merciless, both familiar and utterly alien. To focus on any one aspect was to have the others shift like reflections in disturbed water. He was a kaleidoscope of human potential, constantly in motion while appearing perfectly still. The Great Triumph was structured as a ceremonial display of imperial might, with the Emperor seated upon a massive golden throne constructed for the occasion. Not the golden throne of terror, but a symbolic precursor perhaps. The legions marched past in review, tanks and titans thundered by, shaking the earth with each step. The sound was deafening, yet I cannot recall hearing any of it. All senses seemed muted in his presence, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Hours passed this way, though time itself seemed distorted. Then came the moment that would forever alter my understanding of existence. It was not scheduled, not part of the carefully orchestrated pageantry. In retrospect, I wonder if he knew, if he had always known, if the entire spectacle was arranged for no other purpose than what was about to transpire. The orc attack was sudden, emerging from hidden bunkers that Imperial forces had somehow overlooked in their sweep of the area. Not a full assault, no. The Greenskin Empire had been broken. This was something else. A last act of defiance. A suicide mission aimed at decapitating the Imperium in its moment of triumph. At their head strode the largest orc I had ever seen. Larger even than the warlord whose death had precipitated the triumph. A monster clad in crude metal, roaring a challenge that seemed to shake the air itself. Later accounts would name it Urlak Urg, but I do not recall ever hearing its name spoken aloud. Names were irrelevant in what followed. The Emperor stood. That simple action, rising from his seat, silenced everything. Not just voices, but thoughts. The universe contracted to a single point of awareness focused entirely on him. What happened next has been described as a battle. The official histories speak of the Emperor drawing his sword, of a clash between humanity's ruler and the beast. They describe blows exchanged, strength matched against strength, skill against savage fury. None of it is true. The Emperor raised his hand, a simple gesture, palm outward, the kind of motion one might make to request silence or to signal a pause. The orc was perhaps 200 meters distant when this occurred. It was charging forward, propelled by pistons and muscles and hate, a green avalanche of destruction. And then it simply ceased to be. There was no flash of light, no psychic thunderbolt, no dramatic explosion. One moment the beast existed, roaring its defiance. The next it was dust. Not even dust. It was nothing. As though it had never been. The absolute negation of its existence was so complete that I found myself questioning whether I had actually seen it at all. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything. As though for a brief moment, reality itself had forgotten how to function. What struck me most was the lack of effort. The Emperor had not strained, had not braced himself, had not gathered his power in any way perceptible to those watching. He had simply decided that the orc would no longer exist, and the universe had complied without question. It was then that I noticed the Primarchs. These demigods, these perfect beings engineered for conquest and rule, were kneeling, not in orderly fashion as part of the ceremony. They were kneeling like frightened children. Some had their heads bowed so low they nearly touched the ground. Others were visibly trembling. Magnus the Red, the most psychically gifted of them all, had his hands pressed against his temples, a trickle of blood running from his single eye. They had seen something we mortals had not, sensed something beyond our limited perceptions. Whatever power had unmade the Orc had affected them profoundly, and then the Emperor turned his gaze upon the assembled masses. I cannot describe what it felt like when his attention passed over me. The sensation defies categorization. It was not physical, not a weight or a pressure or a pain, though it contained elements of all these things. It was the sudden, horrific understanding that everything I was, everything I had ever been, or thought, or felt, or hidden, was completely exposed, not examined, not judged, simply known, in totality, with a comprehension so complete that my own understanding of myself seemed a child's crayon drawing in comparison. For the briefest fraction of a second, I experienced what it meant to be truly seen by him, not as a remembrancer, not as a human being, but as a collection of atoms temporarily arranged into a pattern complex enough to generate consciousness, a fleeting arrangement that he could alter or erase with less effort than I would expend to brush away an insect. In that moment, I understood what the Primarchs already knew, what had made them kneel without command. The Emperor of mankind was not merely superhuman, he was not merely a psyker of unparalleled power, he was something else entirely, something for which we have no name, no framework of understanding. The gap between him and even his most gifted sons was not one of degree, but of fundamental nature. The rest of that day passed in a blur. The formalities continued. Horus was elevated to War Master, speeches were given, honors bestowed. I recorded it all automatically, my hands moving while my mind remained frozen in that singular moment of revelation. What I had witnessed was not the Emperor's power of creation or destruction. It was his absolute dominion over reality itself, the kind of authority that does not persuade or overcome or defeat, it simply is, and all existence bends around it like light around a singularity. That night, alone in my quarters, I reviewed my recordings and found something disturbing. The incident with the Orc was not there. In its place was footage of the Emperor engaging the creature in conventional combat, striking it down with his sword in a display of martial skill. A heroic scene, perfectly composed, dramatically satisfying, but it had never happened. I checked other footage, spoke with fellow remembrancers. Everyone remembered the same, falsified version of events, a version that was rapidly becoming the official truth. By morning, I began to doubt my own recollection. Had I imagined it? Had the pressure of the occasion, the overwhelming psychic presence of the Emperor and his sons, caused me to hallucinate? Was I suffering from some kind of stress reaction common to mortals in the presence of beings so far beyond us? It was then that I noticed I was being watched. Not obviously. There were no custodians at my door, no interrogators waiting to question me, but in the days that followed, I found my movements subtly directed, my assignments changed, my access to certain individuals restricted for seemingly bureaucratic reasons. I was being isolated, tested, observed to see if I would speak of what I had witnessed, of what I alone seemed to remember. I did not. Some instinct for self-preservation kept me silent. I played my part, recorded the sanitized version of events, added my name to the official accounts that would be distributed throughout the nascent Imperium. But I did not forget. In the months that followed, I was gradually shifted away from direct coverage of the Emperor and the Primarchs. My assignments became more peripheral, focusing on the human elements of the crusade, the common soldiers, the newly compliant worlds, the spread of imperial culture and governance. Important work, necessary work, but far from the center of power. I told myself it was natural rotation of duties, that no single remembrancer could expect to document the Emperor himself for long. But I knew the truth. I had seen something I was not meant to see, remembered something I was not meant to remember, and somehow he knew. As the Great Crusade continued and the Emperor returned to Terra, I convinced myself that the incident would fade from significance, that whatever momentary attention I had drawn to myself would dissipate as larger events unfolded. I was wrong. What I had witnessed on Ulanor was merely the beginning, the first glimpse into an abyss so vast that even now, decades later, I struggle to comprehend its dimensions. But I must try. The truth demands it, however dangerous it may be, even if I am the only one who remembers. The truth about the Emperor of mankind, about what he truly is, and what that means for us all. In the days after Ulanor, strange dreams began to plague my sleep. Not nightmares exactly, though they left me with the same sense of lingering dread. In these dreams, I stood once again on that dusty plain, watching the triumph unfold. But this time, I was not merely an observer. I was being observed, studied with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone into the very core of my being. And always, at the moment the orc was unmade, I would look down to find my own body beginning to dissolve, turning to dust not from the extremities inward, but from the inside out, as though whatever essential spark made me myself was being systematically erased, leaving the physical shell to collapse in its absence. I would wake gasping, clutching at my chest, taking frantic inventory of my thoughts and memories to assure myself I was still whole, still myself. It took nearly a month before I realized the dreams were not random manifestations of trauma or stress. They were a message, a warning. What I had seen could not be unseen, what I knew could not be unknown. But it could be buried, contained, sealed away behind walls of fear and self-preservation. That was the choice being offered to me: silence and life, or truth and obliteration. I chose silence. What else could I do? And so I continued my work, documenting the glory of the Great Crusade, recording humanity's manifest destiny among the stars, all the while carrying inside me a truth I dared not even think about directly, for fear that the mere act of recollection might draw his attention once more. For a time, it seemed to work. The dreams gradually decreased in frequency, though they never disappeared entirely. I was allowed to continue my duties, albeit at a comfortable distance from the highest echelons of imperial power. Life acquired a veneer of normality. Then came the summons. 3 years after Ulanor, while attached to an expeditionary fleet led by the Imperial Fists, I received orders to return to Terra. No explanation was given, no purpose stated. Simply a directive that could not be ignored. The journey took weeks in which I had ample time to consider all the possible reasons for such a recall, each scenario more terrifying than the last. By the time the transport entered the Sol system, I had convinced myself I was being brought back for execution. That whatever grace period I had been granted was at an end. The reality was both better and worse. I was met at the spaceport not by custodians or agents of the Sigillite, but by a minor administrative functionary, a grey little man with a grey little voice, who informed me that I had been reassigned to the Office of Chronological Accuracy and Factual Verification, a division of the Remembrancer Order responsible for reviewing and standardizing historical accounts before they entered the official record. In other words, I was being made an editor, a reviser of other people's truths. My new workspace was deep within one of the administrative complexes that had sprung up around the palace, a small, windowless room lined with data stacks and cogitator terminals. My task was simple: review Remembrancer accounts from across the Crusade, check them against approved historical templates, flag any inconsistencies or problematic elements, and either correct them or forward them to higher authorities for resolution. I was being asked to sanitize history, to help construct the narrative that would replace reality. The irony was not lost on me. I, who had witnessed truth being unmade before my eyes, was now an instrument for unmaking the truths of others. It seemed like punishment disguised as promotion, a subtle cruelty worthy of minds far beyond human scale. Yet as the months passed, I began to discern a pattern in the materials that crossed my desk, accounts of unusual phenomena, reports of the Emperor or the Primarchs displaying abilities that defied conventional explanation, instances where reality itself seemed to bend around their presence. All of these were flagged for special attention, all required the highest level of revision. In many cases, the original remembrances themselves were quietly removed from duty, listed as having suffered psychological breakdowns or transferred to remote assignments where their stories would find no audience. I was not the only one who had seen behind the veil, not the only one being silenced. This realization should have provided some comfort, I suppose, shared burden and all that. Instead, it only deepened my dread. The scale of the deception was vast, systematic, not the work of moments but of careful, deliberate design. What was being hidden, and why? The question consumed me. In defiance of both orders and instinct, I began to compile my own private archive, copies of unrevised accounts, records of which remembrances had been removed and under what circumstances, patterns of revision that might reveal the shape of the thing being concealed. It was dangerous work. If discovered, it would mean my immediate elimination. I had no illusions about that. But something within me rebelled at being made a tool of obfuscation. If my own memories were to be sacrificed on the altar of convenient history, I would at least know what I was dying for. 6 months into my new assignment, I made a discovery that nearly broke me. Among the accounts flagged for extensive revision was a series of reports from a remembrancer attached to the Wordbearer's Legion. This individual, a woman named Cyrene Valantion, had documented the compliance of a world called Kur. The official version of events described a reluctant but necessary use of force against a stubborn human culture that refused peaceful integration into the Imperium. Regrettable but justified, in service to the greater goal of unification. The unrevised account told a different story. It spoke of the Emperor himself appearing before the Primarch Lorgar, who had spent decades leading the people of conquered worlds to worship his father as a god. It described how the Emperor had not merely rebuked his son for this error, but had forced the entire Wordbearer's Legion to kneel in the ashes of a city they had built in his honor, a city he had destroyed with a thought, and it described how, as the Primarch knelt weeping in the dust, the Emperor had done something to him, not physically, not with words, but with his will alone. Cyrene's account described it as rewriting something fundamental within the Primarch's mind, like a scribe correcting errors in a manuscript. The parallels to what I had witnessed at Ulanor were unmistakable, the same casual display of power that defied comprehension, the same absolute authority over not just flesh but reality itself. But this was worse, far worse, for this was not power directed against a Xenos enemy. This was the Emperor reshaping the mind of his own son, altering his very identity as easily as changing words on a page. What kind of being could do such a thing? What kind of father? The questions were heretical, I knew that even then, but once asked, they could not be unasked. They festered in my mind as I dutifully revised Cyrene's account, replacing her horrified testimony with bland descriptions of strategic redeployment and administrative restructuring. And all the while, I wondered, if the Emperor could do that to a Primarch, one of his own creations specifically engineered to withstand psychic influence, what could he do to an ordinary human mind? What had he perhaps already done to mine? The thought was paralyzing. How could I trust any of my memories, any of my thoughts, if they could be rewritten without my knowledge? How could I be certain that the very act of questioning wasn't itself a programmed response, a psychological failsafe designed to lead me into revealing myself? I began to examine my own mind with obsessive intensity, searching for inconsistencies, gaps, thoughts that seemed somehow external to my own patterns of thinking. I found nothing conclusive. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as they say. The doubt remained. Metastasized, became a constant companion, and still, I continued my work. Continued compiling my secret archive, continued living under the shadow of a truth I could neither fully remember nor completely forget. A truth about the Emperor of mankind that was far more terrifying than any official doctrine of divinity could ever be. He was not a god in the sense that humanity had traditionally conceived such beings. He was something else, something for which we have no name. And whatever he was, whatever plans he had for humanity, I was increasingly certain they were not what any of us had been told. As my time on Terra stretched from months into years, I developed a routine designed to conceal my private investigations. My days were spent in diligent service to the official narrative, my nights in careful documentation of the reality being obscured. I constructed a hidden archive within my modest hab unit, data slates and physical notes concealed within mundane objects, their contents encoded in a cipher of my own devising. It was during this period that I began to notice the subtle surveillance. Nothing obvious, nothing I could definitively prove. A servitor that passed my hab unit at the same time each evening, data requests that seemed to log which files I accessed and for how long, the occasional feeling of being watched when alone in my workspace. I might have dismissed it as paranoia, a natural outgrowth of the secret I carried. But one incident convinced me the attention was real. I had been researching accounts of the Council of Nicaea, where the Emperor had decreed limits on the use of psychic powers within the legions. The official records painted it as a reasoned debate, followed by a wise and measured judgment. Magnus and his legion censured for their excessive reliance on warpcraft, but the Librarius program preserved in modified form. Yet scattered through various remembrancer accounts were hints of something more dramatic. References to the Emperor displaying his own psychic might in ways that left even the most powerful psychers among his sons shaken. Descriptions of how, when delivering his judgment, his voice seemed to bypass the physical senses and speak directly into the minds of all present with such authority that many were left bleeding from their ears and eyes. As I was compiling these discrepancies, I noticed a figure standing in the doorway of my workspace, a custodian, golden armor gleaming even in the dim light, guardian spear held casually at his side. He said nothing, did nothing, merely stood watching me for exactly 37 seconds. I counted each one, frozen in my seat, heart threatening to burst from my chest. Then, without a word, he turned and left. The message could not have been clearer had it been screamed directly into my mind. I was being allowed to continue, for now, but I was not unobserved. That night, I destroyed a significant portion of my archive. Not all. I could not bring myself to erase everything, but enough to create a plausible deniability should my quarters be searched. And I restricted my subsequent investigations to mental notation only, committing patterns and connections to memory rather than physical or digital record. It was not long after this warning that the galaxy began to change in ways none of us could have anticipated. Rumors filtered back to Terra of discord among the legions, of tensions between Primarchs, of Horus Lupercal, elevated at Ulanor to the position of War Master, growing increasingly independent in his prosecution of the Great Crusade. Official channels dismissed these as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Natural frictions in a vast and complex military organization stretching across countless star systems. Nothing to concern the average citizen. Nothing to suggest the Emperor's grand vision was anything but on course. But in my position, sifting through reports from across the Imperium, I began to see a different pattern emerging. The discrepancies were subtle at first. Expeditions that failed to check in on schedule, unusual troop deployments, communications protocols being modified without clear justification. Then came the Istvan atrocity. The purging of 3 loyal legions by their brothers. The revelation that Horus, the most favored son, had turned against the Emperor. The shock that rippled through Terra was genuine and profound. None of us, not even those like myself who harbored private doubts about the imperial truth, had imagined such a betrayal possible. The Primarchs were supposed to be beyond such base impulses. They were the Emperor's vision made manifest, perfection given form and purpose. If they could fall, what did that say about the vision itself? In the chaos that followed, As Terra began to prepare for the possibility of war coming to the throne world itself, my role changed again. The Office of Chronological Accuracy and Factual Verification was repurposed almost overnight. No longer were we merely editing history, we were actively creating it. Constructing a narrative that would explain the unexplainable, justify the unjustifiable. Horus had been corrupted, we were told to report. Tainted by Xenos influence or unknown warp entities encountered in the void. His brothers who had joined him were similarly deceived or coerced. This was not a legitimate schism within the Imperial project, but an external attack using internal vectors. The Emperor remained infallible, his vision untarnished. Any suggestion otherwise was not merely incorrect but dangerous, potentially sympathetic to the enemy. I did my job. What choice did I have? I wrote the lies, disseminated the propaganda, helped shape public perception of a conflict whose true nature I suspected was being hidden from us all. And all the while, I continued my private investigation, connecting dots few others were positioned to see. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Nearly every instance of the Emperor displaying the kind of reality-bending power I had witnessed at Ulanor was followed, sometimes years later, by dysfunction or rebellion in those who had been present, as though exposure to whatever he truly was had a corrosive effect on the minds of even his closest sons. Magnus's desperate psychic warning that shattered the palace's warp defenses, Lorgar's slow descent from most faithful to first heretic, Angron's uncontrollable rage, Perturabo's festering resentment. All of them had, at one point or another, been subjected to direct psychic contact with their father. All had emerged changed in ways subtle at first but catastrophic in the end. Was this a coincidence? Or had they seen, as I had, behind the mask of humanity the Emperor wore, glimpsed something so fundamentally alien, so utterly beyond our conception of existence, that their post-human minds could not endure the knowledge unchanged? I have no definitive answer, even now. Only conjectures stitched together from fragments of suppressed truth. But I believe the heresy that nearly destroyed the Imperium was not merely a political rebellion or a struggle for power. It was a psychic immune response to a presence too vast for even transhuman minds to safely comprehend. As the heresy progressed and the forces of the War Master fought their way toward Terra, my work became increasingly frantic. The stream of information needing sanitization grew to a flood. Reports of impossible feats performed by both loyal and traitor Primarchs, accounts of reality distorting around their battles, descriptions of entities from beyond normal, space manifesting alongside the rebel forces. Much of this was clearly mass hysteria or battlefield confusion, but buried within the noise were threads of genuine terror. Witnesses describing Primarchs and their legionaries changing in both form and essence, growing more powerful in ways that defied physical laws, but also more unstable, more extreme in their aspects. As though whatever process the Emperor had used to create them was now accelerating out of control in some while reversing in others. Evolution and devolution occurring simultaneously across different vectors, and always, underlying these accounts, was a sense that reality itself was becoming more malleable, more subject to the force of will and belief. The barriers between materium and immaterium growing thinner as the conflict intensified. It was during this period that I experienced the dream again, the same vision that had haunted me after Ulanor. Standing on that dusty plain, watching the Emperor unmake the orc with a gesture, feeling myself begin to dissolve from within. I experienced what came after the unmaking, not oblivion, as I had feared, but absorption, integration. The constituent elements of my consciousness, the pattern that I recognized as myself, being drawn into a vast and intricate lattice of other minds. A psychic architecture so complex and extensive that it dwarfed the physical reality around it. And at the center of this lattice, binding it together, directing its energies, was him. The Emperor, revealed not as a man or even a god, but as a principle. A fundamental force expressed through human form but not contained or defined by it. In the dream, I understood what he was attempting. What the Great Crusade, the Primarchs, the entire imperial project had been engineered to achieve, not mere conquest or unification or even species survival, but transcendence. The elevation of humanity from a collection of disparate biological entities into a single, unified consciousness capable of reshaping reality according to its collective will. A psychic species apotheosis with the Emperor as both catalyst and template. I woke from this dream not in terror but in awe. And in that moment of waking clarity, I recognized the dream for what it was. Not merely a product of my own mind, but a transmission. A fragment of understanding allowed to take root in my consciousness. Whether it had come from the Emperor himself, or was merely backwash from the increasingly turbulent warp, I cannot say, but its impact was profound. For the first time since Ulanor, I felt I had glimpsed not just the fact of the Emperor's power, but its purpose, and that purpose was both more magnificent and more terrible than anything humanity had conceived. We were not meant to remain as we were, not meant to continue as individuals with private thoughts and separate destinies. We were raw material for something greater, a new order of existence with the Emperor as its heart and mind. Some would call this divinity, others would name it tyranny on a cosmic scale. I no longer know where the distinction lies. All I know is what I witnessed, what I pieced together from fragments of suppressed truth, and what I have come to believe over long decades of reflection. The Emperor of mankind is not, and never was, human as we understand the term. He may have been born of human stock in a distant age, may have walked among us as one of our kind for millennia. But what he evolved into, what he became in order to guide our species, was something fundamentally different. A consciousness so vast and complex that it required a physical form engineered specifically to contain it without collapsing into the warp. A being capable of perceiving and manipulating the underlying structures of reality through pure psychic will. An intelligence operating on scales of time and possibility that make our linear perceptions seem like awareness of insects. This is what I believe I glimpsed at Ulanor. Not merely a display of overwhelming psychic might, but a momentary unveiling of his true nature. A brief, localized suspension of the psychic glamour that allows other beings to perceive him in comprehensible form. For that single moment, when he unmade the orc with a gesture, I believe the Emperor stopped pretending to be human, stopped limiting himself to the physical and temporal constraints that define our existence, and in doing so, revealed to those present a truth few were equipped to process. The Primarchs understood, I think. They who were crafted from his own essence, designed specifically to channel portions of his power. They recognized what was revealed because it resonated with something buried within their own posthuman nature. A seed of the same transcendent potential that had reached full flower in their creator. That is why they knelt without being commanded. Not in worship or even fear, but in instinctive recognition of an existential hierarchy as immutable as physics itself. And perhaps that glimpse of what they were made to eventually become, of the distance still separating them from their intended final form, was what planted the first seeds of discord. To see your own potential future laid bare before you, to understand the path of transformation still ahead and the loss of self it would entail, would be a profound shock to any consciousness, even one as sturdy as a Primarch's. For me, a mere unaugmented human, the revelation was both more limited and more survivable precisely because I lacked the capacity to fully comprehend it. I saw the surface ripples of a disturbance in depths I could not fathom, but even that limited perception was enough to fundamentally alter the course of my life. To set me on this path of hidden inquiry and dangerous knowledge. As terror prepared for siege and the forces of Horus closed in on the Sol system, my work took on a new urgency. No longer was I merely sanitizing reports of past events. I was actively involved in shaping the narrative of current ones, deciding which aspects of the unfolding catastrophe would enter the public consciousness and which would be suppressed. It was triage of information, preserving what was deemed necessary for morale and stability, while excising anything that might provoke panic or undermine confidence in the Emperor's ultimate victory. In truth, none of us knew if victory was possible. The scale of the calamity facing the Imperium was unprecedented. Half its armies turned against it. The Primarchs divided. Warp travel disrupted by immense storms. And at the head of the traitor forces, Horus Lupercal, once the most brilliant military mind of the Great Crusade, now directed against the empire he had helped build. Yet amid this darkness, a curious calm had settled over the imperial palace. Those who worked closest to the emperor reported no signs of distress or uncertainty from the master of mankind. He continued his mysterious project deep beneath the palace, emerging only occasionally to issue instructions to the primarchs and generals coordinating the defense. These appearances became the subject of intense scrutiny among those of us tasked with managing information. Rumors abounded. Some claimed the emperor was growing physically weaker, his energies consumed by whatever work he was conducting behind sealed doors. Others insisted he was evolving into something beyond his previous state, shedding the last vestiges of humanity as the crisis demanded his full potential. The truth, as I pieced it together from fragments of testimony and my own observations from a carefully maintained distance, was more complex. The emperor was changing, that much seemed clear, but the nature of that change defied simple categorization. His physical appearance remained consistent, the same majestic form that had led the Great Crusade. Yet those admitted to his presence reported an increasing difficulty in maintaining direct awareness of him, as though their minds would slide away from the fact of his existence unless deliberately forced to focus. One account, suppressed immediately upon receipt, described it as trying to look directly at a hole in reality, not a tear or a wound, but an intentional absence, a place where the conventional laws of existence have been politely asked to make an exception. What struck me most about these reports was their consistency with what I had witnessed years earlier at Ulanor. The same sense of reality bending around a central point of will, the same suggestion of a power operating on levels beyond conventional psychic phenomena. But now that power was being channeled with unprecedented focus and purpose, directed towards some end none of us fully comprehended. In my official capacity, I was instructed to emphasize the emperor's confidence and control, to present him as the immovable anchor of humanity's defense, the one fixed point around which all resistance to the heresy revolved. This was not difficult, for in all observable ways, he was exactly that. Yet in my private investigation, I was beginning to suspect that this unshakable confidence stemmed not from certainty of military victory, but from a perspective that regarded the entire heresy, catastrophic though it was, as merely a component in a much larger process, a necessary phase in humanity's directed evolution. This was, I must emphasize, conjecture on my part. Dangerous conjecture that I shared with no one, but it was consistent with the pattern of revelations I had accumulated over the years, with the dream vision of humanity's psychic elevation, with countless small comments and actions from the Emperor that only made sense if one assumed he was operating according to a timeline extending far beyond the immediate crisis. As the Siege of Terra began in earnest, with the forces of Horus establishing orbit and beginning their assault on the palace defenses, a new type of account began to filter through my office. Reports from the front lines describing instances where reality itself seemed to warp and distort around particularly intense concentrations of conflict. Time flowing at different rates in different sectors of the same battlefield, matter behaving according to impossible physics, wounds that could not be explained by conventional weaponry. The line between symbolic and literal reality blurring until they became functionally indistinguishable. Most of these I was instructed to dismiss as the hallucinatory effects of stress and fear, as the byproducts of exotic weapons or previously unknown Xenos technologies deployed by the traitors. But I knew better. I had seen the Emperor unmake an orc with a gesture, had felt reality bend to his will on Ulanor. These new phenomena were simply the same principles operating on a broader scale, with less precise control. The veil between materium and immaterium was thinning as the conflict intensified, and in that liminal state, the pure power of will and belief was becoming an increasingly dominant force in shaping physical reality. This was, I came to believe, both the greatest danger of the heresy and its true purpose. Not the conquest of the Imperium or the death of the Emperor, but the transformation of humanity's collective psychic potential into a weapon of unimaginable power, a weapon that could reshape existence itself. Horus sought to wield that weapon for his own ascension. The Emperor intended it for something else entirely, and caught between these two transhuman wills, reality itself was beginning to buckle. The culmination of this conflict, the final confrontation between father and son, is a matter of historical record, or at least, a version of it is. The Emperor and his most loyal primarchs teleporting to Horus's battle barge, the desperate fight through corrupted decks, the final duel in which the Emperor was grievously wounded but ultimately triumphant. Horus destroyed utterly, both body and soul. The costly victory that left the master of mankind a broken shell, sustained only by the technological miracle of the Golden Throne. This is the narrative I helped construct in the aftermath. The official truth propagated across the Imperium during the years of rebuilding that followed. A tragic epic of sacrifice and Pyrrhic triumph that would serve as the foundation myth for 10,000 years of imperial rule. It contains elements of truth, but it is not the whole truth. I was not aboard the vengeful spirit. I did not witness the final confrontation between the Emperor and his fallen son. Few did, and fewer still survived to report what they had seen. But in my position, I had access to the unfiltered accounts of those who did return. Accounts taken before the official narrative calcified, before the ecclesiarchy rose to codify the Emperor's divinity, before the brutal simplicity of a secular empire became the baroque theocracy of the modern Imperium. These accounts, fragmentary and contradictory though they were, painted a picture significantly different from the accepted history. They spoke not of a physical duel between the Emperor and Horus, though such a confrontation may have been how it manifested to limited transhuman senses. Rather, they described a conflict on multiple levels of existence simultaneously, a battle of wills that expressed itself physically, but was decided on a psychic plane beyond conventional comprehension. According to the most coherent of these testimonies, provided by a severely wounded custodian who had accompanied the Emperor aboard the battle barge, the final moments of the confrontation were marked by a curious stillness. Horus and the Emperor, facing each other across a chamber warped by energies no mortal was meant to control. Around them, time itself seemed to pause, not frozen, but holding its breath, waiting to see which way the fulcrum of history would tip. And then, the Emperor did something unexpected, something that defied the tactical logic of the moment and the strategic necessities of the war. He hesitated, despite all that Horus had done. Despite the trillions dead, the Imperium in flames, the dream of the Great Crusade shattered, despite his own loyal sons slain by their brother's treachery. Despite standing on the precipice of total defeat, the Emperor hesitated. The custodian's account suggests this was not due to lingering sentiment or paternal reluctance to destroy his finest creation. Rather, it was a moment of genuine uncertainty, as though the master of mankind, architect of humanity's future, shaper of species' destiny, found himself at a crossroads he had not anticipated, faced with a choice whose consequences even his vast intellect could not fully calculate. In that moment of hesitation, Horus struck. Not physically, though I imagine some blow was landed on the Emperor's material form, but psychically, with the combined might of his own transhuman will and whatever warp entities had empowered his rebellion. The blow should have been decisive. By all accounts, it very nearly was. The Emperor was wounded in ways that transcended physical trauma. His essence, the immense psychic architecture I had glimpsed in my dream vision, was sundered along fault lines that may have existed since his own transformation from mere human to whatever he had become. Yet in that moment of near destruction, when victory seemed within Horus's grasp, something changed. The custodian's account becomes less coherent here, descending into symbolic language and religious imagery that may be attempts to describe sensory experiences beyond the capacity of even augmented human perception. But the core of it aligns with other fragments I have gathered over the decades. At the moment of his greatest vulnerability, the Emperor stopped holding back, stopped limiting himself to forms and functions comprehensible to human or even transhuman minds, stopped pretending to be merely the most powerful being in the galaxy and simply was, in totality, whatever he truly is. The effect was cataclysmic. Reality within the chamber collapsed entirely, resolving into something the custodian could only describe as absolute negation followed by perfect definition. The end of all possibility, and then the birth of a single, inevitable truth. When conventional perception reasserted itself, Horus was gone. Not dead, not defeated, not banished. Gone. Removed from existence with such totality that even the warp entities that had empowered him were silenced. As though he had never been, his pattern wiped from the underlying structure of reality itself. But the cost was equally absolute. The Emperor, having manifested an aspect of his true nature too vast for even his engineered form to contain, was reduced to a state beyond death, yet short of life. His consciousness fragmented, his power scattered across dimensions, his physical form a broken vessel preserved only by the most drastic technological intervention. The Golden Throne, intended for a very different purpose in the Emperor's grand design, became instead his life support system and prison, a device to anchor the fragments of his consciousness, to prevent their complete dissolution into the warp, and to maintain the essential psychic functions he had been performing for humanity. This is the truth I believe lies at the heart of the Horus heresy and the foundation of the modern Imperium. Not a straightforward conflict between loyalty and treachery, not a simple tale of a father betrayed by his son, but something far more profound and disturbing. A pivotal moment in a species-level transformation orchestrated across millennia by a being whose true nature and intentions remain fundamentally unknowable to those he would elevate. A process derailed not by the rebellion itself, but by the unexpected choices made in its final moments. This is what I have come to believe over long decades of hidden inquiry, what I have pieced together from fragments of suppressed testimony, from patterns in redacted history, and from my own witnessed glimpse behind the veil at Ulanor. And this is why I have lived in fear ever since. For to know even this much is dangerous beyond measure. To speak it aloud, heresy by any definition. Yet as my own end approaches, I find myself compelled to record these insights. Not as definitive truth, for how could I claim to comprehend the designs of such a being, but as a warning and a perspective that might prove valuable to those who come after. The Emperor is not dead, nor is he truly alive as we understand the term. He exists in a state beyond conventional categories, his consciousness simultaneously fragmented and unified across multiple planes of existence. The Golden Throne maintains what remains of his material form while serving as an anchor for his scattered essence. Yet despite this diminished state, his power remains incalculable. The Astronomicon, burning for 10,000 years on the psychic energy he continues to generate even in his fractured condition. The creation and maintenance of the Sisters of Silence, the constant war against incursions from the warp. All powered by whatever fraction of his true potential remains accessible in his current state. I have often wondered, in the decades since the heresy, whether this outcome was truly unanticipated by the Emperor, whether the apparent failure of his grand design might in fact be its fulfillment by other means. Consider the Imperium as it now exists, a galaxy-spanning theocracy dedicated to a single figure of worship. Trillion souls directed in unified purpose, their collective psychic potential focused through religious devotion, faith and ritual channeling human consciousness along prescribed paths, generation after generation. Is this not, in a sense, the species-level psychic unification I glimpsed in my vision, not achieved through the remendo, enlightened secular progress the Emperor originally espoused, but through the brute evolutionary pressure of constant warfare and the psychic focusing mechanism of religious faith? The methods are different, the time frame vastly extended, the human cost incalculably higher, but the vector remains consistent with what I believe to have been the Emperor's ultimate goal: the elevation of humanity into a unified psychic entity capable of reshaping reality through collective will. What we perceive as the Imperium's 10,000-year deterioration into superstition and stagnation might in fact be a necessary phase in a process still unfolding according to its architect's design. A cocoon stage in which humanity's potential gestates, protected by layers of ignorance and dogma from threats it is not yet ready to face directly. If this conjecture has merit, it raises disturbing questions about the nature of the being we call Emperor, about the depth and breadth of foresight such planning would require, about the moral calculus that would justify such suffering in service to such an end. Questions I am not qualified to answer. Questions perhaps no human mind is equipped to properly formulate, let alone resolve. All I know with certainty is what I witnessed on that dusty plain at Ulanor, the casual unmaking of an enemy with a gesture, the absolute authority over reality itself, the kind of power that makes gods tremble and men wish they were blind, and I know that even that display, awesome though it was, represented the merest fraction of what the Emperor truly is. A momentary, localized relaxation of the psychic constraints that allow him to interact with conventional reality without destroying it. What I have come to believe, over long years of hidden inquiry and dangerous reflection, is that the being we call the Emperor of mankind may be the first of a new order of existence, neither human nor god in any sense we have previously understood, but a principality of consciousness extending across dimensions and operating according to laws we have yet to comprehend. The first, perhaps, but intended not to be the last, for I believe humanity was meant to follow, to transcend our current limitations and join him in whatever state of existence he has pioneered. That was the purpose of the Great Crusade, the reason for the Imperial Truth, the goal of the Webway Project. All components in a grand design to shepherd our species through an evolutionary threshold no organic intelligence has previously survived. Perhaps it still is. Perhaps even now, shattered and enthroned, the Emperor guides us along that path by means too subtle and circuitous for us to recognize. Perhaps the Imperium, in all its brutal, oppressive glory, is still performing its designed function in species elevation. Or perhaps the design has genuinely failed. Perhaps we are truly alone in a galaxy of nightmares with only the fragmented remnants of an incomprehensible being standing between us and extinction. I do not know. I cannot know. Such truths lie beyond the reach of minds still bound to conventional physics and sequential time. All I know is what I have shared here, my own small glimpse behind the veil of reality, the memory I was not supposed to retain, the connections I was not supposed to make. And as I prepare to take these dangerous insights with me into whatever awaits beyond death, I find myself both terrified and strangely comforted by one final consideration. If what I believe about the Emperor is even partially correct, if he truly perceives across dimensions and operates on scales of time and possibility that dwarf our linear existence, then he has always known I would retain that memory from Ulanor, has always known I would spend my life investigating the truths behind the imperial facade, has always known I would eventually record these heretical speculations, and he allowed it to happen. Why? That is the question that haunts my final days. Why permit such dangerous knowledge to exist, however obscurely? Why allow even one insignificant remembrancer to pierce the veil, however partially? Perhaps it is simply that my efforts are too insignificant to warrant attention from such a being, a trivial aberration not worth the energy required to correct it. Or perhaps, and this thought chills me more deeply, the preservation and transmission of these fragments of insight serve some purpose in the Emperor's unfathomable design. Perhaps doubt itself is a necessary component in humanity's guided evolution, a counterbalance to blind faith, a seed of cognitive diversity in a species being shaped for unification. I do not know, I cannot know, and soon I will join the ranks of the unnumbered dead whose individual consciousness has been reabsorbed into whatever greater pattern the universe is weaving. But before I go, I leave this record. This testimony of what I witnessed at Ulanor and the conclusions I have drawn from a lifetime of forbidden inquiry. The Emperor's power is not creation or destruction, though he wields both when necessary. It is not psychic dominance or technological mastery, though these are tools at his disposal. His true power, I believe, is absolute dominion over reality itself, the kind that makes gods tremble and men wish they were blind. And whatever he truly is, whatever he truly intends for humanity, I am certain of one thing: it is vaster and stranger and more terrifying than anything our limited minds have conceived. Even now, 10,000 years after his physical form was broken and his consciousness fragmented, I feel his attention moving across the Imperium, perceiving patterns we cannot comprehend, nudging events along courses we cannot predict, guiding humanity toward a future we cannot imagine. Or perhaps, most terrifying of all, simply watching as we struggle and die in our trillions, maintaining the brutal evolutionary pressures needed to forge us into whatever it is we are meant to become. This is what I believe, what I have pieced together from my own unique experiences and dangerous investigations. I offer it not as truth, for how could I claim to know the mind of such a being, but as perspective, as the testimony of one who glimpsed, however briefly and imperfectly, behind the veil of an entity we still do not truly comprehend, despite 10 millennia of worship. The Emperor of mankind is power incarnate, but the nature of that power, and the purpose for which it has been wielded across human history, remains the greatest mystery of our existence. A mystery I now leave to others to contemplate, as I fade into whatever awaits beyond the reach of his golden light. Whether that be true dissolution of consciousness or absorption into a greater whole, I go to it with eyes open, having glimpsed more of the truth than most are permitted to see. I am Jalen Ma. I was there at Ulanor when the Emperor revealed a fraction of his true nature. I saw him unmake an enemy with a gesture. I felt his attention pass over me, exposing every hidden thought and memory to his infinite perception. And I have lived ever since with the knowledge that the being we call Master of Mankind is something far greater and far more terrible than the God we have made him to be. Remember this, should my words survive. The Emperor protects, but what he protects us from, and why, and at what ultimate cost, are questions whose answers would shatter the Imperium more surely than any external enemy ever could. In his light, we live and die according to designs we cannot comprehend, and in that perhaps lies the true measure of his power. For what authority is more absolute than that which does not need to explain itself? What dominion more complete than that which shapes the very perceptions of its subjects? What power more terrifying than that which can unmake reality with a thought and rewrite the minds of demigods with a glance? I leave you with this final observation, drawn from a lifetime of hidden inquiry and dangerous reflection. The Emperor is not a tyrant because he chooses to rule through force. He is a tyrant because, for him, there is no meaningful distinction between his will and reality itself, between what he desires and what is, between the future he has chosen for humanity and the inevitable unfolding of cosmic law. That is the truth I glimpsed at Ulanor, the revelation that has haunted me for 6 decades, the understanding I now surrender to whatever void or unity awaits beyond death. The Emperor of mankind is not a god playing at being human, he is something far more terrifying. He is the universe itself, awakened to consciousness and purpose, choosing to manifest through human form for reasons we are fundamentally incapable of comprehending. And we are all, loyal and traitor alike, merely patterns in the substrate of his emerging design.